This video is part 2 of my aircraft configuration guide for the VelocityOne flight controller, yoke and throttle from Turtle Beach. And this is for the PC version only. If you're looking for the Xbox configuration guide, then check out this video, link in the notes below. To ensure you get the results that you want from this guide, I strongly recommend you watch part 1 and configure the yoke accordingly. If you'd like to know more about the VelocityOne flight yoke and throttle, then check out my earlier initial review video. And as before, all links in the notes below. A warm welcome to the Simhanger. My name's Mark. Thanks for watching and let's get started. Aircraft come in all different shapes and sizes and designed for different purposes, from carrying freight to carrying passengers. Some have one engine, some have two, and some more. And so they use a variety of different controls and combinations of these controls. In this video we're not going to try and do a profile for each aircraft, but a couple of common ones that will cover the use of most aircraft. We're going to create a single engine basic profile which will cover the smaller GA aircraft. Some just use throttle and some use throttle and mixture. We'll also be creating a single engine advanced profile for those aircraft that use throttle, prop and mixture. Of course we'll need a profile for twin engine aircraft which will include reverse thrust where needed. We'll create a profile to cover basic turboprop functions and discuss different options for getting our reverses functional with this controller. And then last but certainly not least, we'll be looking at the airliners as well. This guide assumes that you have completed part 1 of the configuration guide and are familiar with how to configure access and buttons to various bindings and mappings. In part 1 we configured all the common elements for the yoke, and to kick off with we're going to configure the common elements for the quad. Once that's completed, creating different profiles will be quick and easy. We're still in our Cessna 152. But for now, back to our control options menu. And before we move on to the quad, there's one optional change for the yoke. Making sure we're on the yoke basic profile, filter on assigned, then click on autopilot. In part 1, I suggested that the Y button on the yoke could be reserved for switching into VR. If you're not flying in VR or utilize a different button to activate VR, then we can add to our autopilot functions. Now change the filter to all. And if you scroll down about 2/3 of the way, we'll find what we're looking for. Autopilot nav1 hold. And we're going to allocate our Y button to this function. And this will allow us to follow flight plans via our GPS. We're now done with the yoke. Apply and save to keep our changes. Our yoke is now set up and everything is configured other than the HAT2 up and down switch. We deliberately didn't configure this in part 1. As they can be used as an option in setting our reverse thrusters, and we'll look at that later on. As the throttle quadrant is shown as a separate unit, other than that's just been mentioned regarding reverse thrust, all profiles now will be done using the quadrant. So let's change our selected peripheral to the VelocityOne flight quadrant, and in part 1 we only set up the trim for the elevator access, and we set this up on the trim wheel. And I renamed the profile VelocityOne Flight Quad Common. Our common elements will apply to all profiles. And we're going to start off by allocating the flaps to the rightmost throttle lever on the top. And we'll be allocating some functions to the 10 buttons on the quadrant. So let's get started on that. With a filter on all, I'm going to start by setting the flaps, and I'm going to use search by name to make it easy to find. I've typed in flaps, and under secondary control surfaces there is flap access. Click on that. We will start scanning and then we will move the lever. Joystick R, axis Z. I'm happy with that. Validate and then save. We'll now go on and set the parking brake, and I'm going to set that to button B4. That's the button just above the linear throttle control. And the reason is some of the aircraft have parking brakes in very difficult to access areas. So once again we change our filter to all, and in the search by name I'm going to type in parking brake. And the options pop up. The one I'm looking for is toggle parking brake. I'm going to use one button to switch it on and off. Press B4, button 2, validate, and we're done. I now have parking brakes. For some of the other buttons, I'm now going to select lights. Filter on all, menu collapsed, open up lights and then exterior lights. A little way down we'll find all the toggle functions. And the first one I'm looking for is nav lights. And I'm going to set that to the B3 key. Press the button, then validate. Making sure you use the toggle function, you can now go ahead and set up the lights, as indicated on screen. Once completed, apply and save. And now for our final common settings. We're going to configure gear up and gear down. Change your filter to all, and then in the search by name we're going to type in gear. Now this time I'm not using the toggle option, but the gear up and gear down. It's easier. Sometimes I forget whether the gear's up or down. Having a separate button for each makes it a lot easier. And allocate to the buttons as indicated. We've used B11 and B12. We've made some changes, so time to test. First of all, I'm going to put on the nav lights. They're working. Now I'm going to switch on the beacon lights, the red flashing light, by pressing the B5 key. Now the taxi lights, they're good. I'll just switch them off. And now the strobe lights, the flashing lights on the wingtips. Happy with that. And lastly, the landing lights. They're working also. We also set up the flaps so we can check those. The lever's all the way up, flaps are up, and now all the way down, and the flaps are coming down. Push the lever back up to retract the flaps. The Cessna 152 has fixed gear, so we can't test the gear, but we can test the parking brake. Just hide the yoke so we can see it easier. Parking brake off, parking brake on. That's all working great. We're done. Let's get on with our first profile. Many of the smaller GA planes don't have throttle, prop and mixture. Some just have throttle. The Cessna 152 that we're looking at now has throttle and mixture only. We can use the same configuration for both types of aircraft. Back to our control options menu. Our yoke's already set up, so we don't have to worry about that. So back to the quad. We only need to configure this one item. We're going to do that by creating a new profile by going to Preset Manager. There's various options available there. The one we're interested in is duplicate. And we're going to give this profile a new name so we can identify it easily. Let's just pause here to understand an important point. I've duplicated the profile so I don't overwrite my quad common profile. I'm going to leave that one as my blank, as it were. In the future, I may want to come up with some different configuration. Maybe a 3-prop profile. At the end of the day, I want to end up with one profile covering all the common elements for my yoke. Then all I need to do is change my quad profile to suit the type of aircraft that I'm flying. Okay, so back to our config. And I'm going to call it VelocityOne Flight Single Basic. And then click OK. And we have a new profile that's carried over all the other default or common settings that we've already done. All we need to do now is configure the throttle and mixture. Filter to all, to power management, and then to throttle. And once we're in here, we want to page down until we find Throttle 1 Access. There it is. Click in the box. I'm going to move my linear throttle control, the one with the black handle, and it comes up as joystick L axis X. That's fine. I can just move the axis to make sure that it's working. And uncheck the reverse axis box. Now onto our mixture. We can collapse the throttle menu. Once that's done, we can choose mixture, and we're going to be looking for exactly the same thing. Mixture access 0 to 100%. There it is. Start scanning and then move the linear control. Joystick L, axis Z. And once again, uncheck the reverse access box. Because we've already set up all the common elements, that's it, we're done. Apply and save, and we can go back into the sim and give it a test. That's all working exactly as expected. If you find your controls are operating backwards to what you see in Sim, don't forget to uncheck the reverse access box. To demonstrate the single prop advanced, I've changed aircraft to the Beechcraft Bonanza G36. And as you can see in the cockpit, it's got a throttle, prop lever and mixture as well. So this change is going to be fairly straightforward. Making sure we're on the single basic profile, we now need to create another one, Preset Manager, and once again duplicate. We're going to rename this one, and unsurprisingly I'm going to call it VelocityOne Flight Single Advanced. Profile has changed under the quad, and now we can make our changes. And we only need to do one. Change the filter to all, and then under Power Management we're looking for Propeller. And under the Propeller menu we're looking for Propeller 1 Access. Move the blue handled linear control. Joystick L, Axis Y is correct. Validate. Uncheck the reverse axis box. And we're done. Let's give it a test. The propeller axis is now active. On to the next profile. Staying with the single props for now, we're moving on to a different category of aircraft, the turboprop. And they're different for two main reasons. One, the mixture control works slightly different, and secondly, most have a reverse function for the prop to help them slow down. And these are things we haven't covered yet. At first glance, things look much the same. We've got our throttle, which in a turboprop is called your power or thrust lever. Our prop control, controlling our RPM. And our mixture control, which is called a condition lever. And in a turboprop, a condition lever only has three positions: high idle, which is fully forward, low idle, and fuel cutoff. It's not a graduated control as we've seen previously. Also notice that even though my throttle is all the way down to full idle, there's an area behind that, and that's to move the throttle into reverse. Let's head back to our control options. To more accurately reflect what we see in Sim, I'm going to use the levers on top of the quadrant and not the vernier controls. I'm using the general aviation handles for the top levers, and in the configuration of throttle, prop, mixture and flap. Making sure that our quad is on the single advanced profile. Let's head to the Preset Manager and create a new profile. Once again we duplicate, and this time I'm going to name it VelocityOne Flight Single TR Turbo Reverse, and the new profile is reflected above. We're now ready to make our changes. Leaving our filter for now on assigned, let's go to Power Management and then Throttle. And I'm going to overwrite the assigned Throttle 1 axis. I click in the box, Throttle L, Axis X. Now I'm going to move the lever on top of the quad, the one on the far left. Comes up as Slider Y. I've now overwritten that axis, and I can now move the quadrant lever, and I can see that it's moving. Let's now do the exact same thing for the prop axis, moving it from the linear controls to the top quad. That's now done. Let's now change the filter from assigned to all, and our first course of action is to delete our mixture axis. Under Power Management we go to Mixture, find our mapping and delete it by selecting Clear Current Input and Validate. Our turboprop aircraft has a condition lever, so we choose condition levers and we're looking for condition lever 1 axis. We select that. We're now going to move our third lever from the left to assign it and validate. The fourth lever is already configured to flaps. Remove the reverse axis, apply and save, and we can now go and check it out. We're done, but we can't move the throttle or thrust lever into the reverse position. So before completing this profile, let's turn to the subject of setting reverse thrust. Let's take a quick look at the throttle quadrant. All four top axes are marked from 100 to 0. 0 being fully down. Then as you can see here, there's an area past 0, as is typical for controllers, which is often used for reverse. And at this point, this is normally where a button is, at or just past the detent position. And it's here that I have a concern. If we go to the control panel and then device manager, our yoke is shown as an Xbox wireless controller and the second controller is our quad. Right click the icon and go to game controller settings, choose the second one in the list and properties. I can now move the top levers through full travel, but no button highlights. Normally at the end of the axis movement we would see a button light up as it passed the detent position. I have queried this with Turtle Beach, and I've received this response which tends to lead me to believe there is no button at the detent or just past the detent position for this controller. They say that they intend to update the firmware to use that region when the functionality is introduced for third-party controllers in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And certainly more reverse options are needed within this simulator. And these options, once introduced, may give controllers such as this better and more practical option. But we don't necessarily need any updates or upgrades to use a button function at the detent or past the detent position. But I stand to be corrected on the button at the detent position. But if I'm right, then in my opinion this is a significant oversight on behalf of Turtle Beach. But don't despair, as I still have two options that can give us reverse thrust. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, the two options you would normally choose is toggle throttle reverse thrust or hold throttle reverse thrust. But neither of these works satisfactorily or realistically. You need to move the throttles into the positive range, press the button, and then it moves the thrust levers into reverse pro rata. So let's move on and have a look at the two workable options that I have. If you have a better way, let me know in the comments below. Option 1 is to use buttons to achieve reverse thrust. Change to your yoke basic profile, then under power management we're going to choose throttle. And the first one we're looking for is Throttle Cut. And we're going to configure this to the hat to up switch. Now page down and we're going to be looking for Throttle 1 decrease. And we're going to configure that to the hat to down switch. Click in the scanning box, move the hat switch down, validate. Don't forget to apply and save, and let's give it a test. I'm now going to press my hat 2 switch down, which is throttle 1 decrease, and I'll hold it down until the thrust lever moves into reverse. To come out of reverse there are two options. You can either just move the thrust lever into positive and settle back at idle, or alternatively you can press the hat 2 up switch, and this automatically returns the throttle to idle. For our second option, we're not going to use buttons but just the throttle access itself. So back to the quad profile, the single turbo reverse. With my filter on assigned, I'm going to choose power management, then throttle. And now I'm going to change the filter to all, to bring up all throttle options. And now page down until you find the previous configuration, which is throttle 1 axis. Note there are two throttle 1 axis options. There's also throttle 1 axis 0 to 100%. But first we're going to delete our throttle 1 axis. Click in the box, we clear the configuration by hitting clear current input and validate, and we're reassigning it to throttle 1 axis 0 to 100%. Move the axis until it reads and then validate. Just a point to note, no need to uncheck the reverse axis. Apply and save. Let's go back and give it a test. Using this throttle access, you've got full range of movement, including into reverse thrust area. The only issue you've got is finding that idle point. My thrust lever in Sim is now in idle, but on the quadrant itself it's at about 50%, so controlling the throttle can be a bit tricky. You could of course use the hat 2 up switch, Throttle Cut. We can now go on and complete our single turbo setup, using whichever reverse method you prefer. For me it's option 1, but the final decision is yours. Either option, it works fairly well. To finish off our single props, I just need to do a special mention of the TBM930. This works very well with our turbo reverse profile, as per the Caravan, but shows it in a slightly different way as it operates differently. Let me show you what I mean. I'm now going to full throttle, and now back to idle. I can go into reverse. I'm using option 1, but option 2 works equally as well. Now you note it's only got one lever for both throttle and condition, but there is a workaround for this, and it's using your prop lever. By moving the propeller axis from full to 0, it moves the lever across to the other side. We can now pull the throttle down into the feather position, and now I can move it into the cutoff position by using my throttle decrease button. And we're done. Although I do need to use my mouse to move it out of the cutoff position. But that's a small compromise to pay for getting the TBM930 working well. To create our twin prop profile, I'm using the King Air 350i. This is a turbo prop with reversers, but this profile will work with just about any twin prop. If they don't have reversers, well, that just won't function. Using the single prop turbo reverse profile, everything is working for the King Air, except we've only got throttle 1, prop 1, and condition lever 1. The VelocityOne flight only has 4 axes on the top quad, and we need 6, 2 each for throttle, prop, and mixture. But that's not a problem. We're going to configure throttle 1 and 2 to the same lever on the quad, and do exactly the same for the prop and the condition lever. Once again, we're going to build on our previous profile, the single turboprop reverse. And you've probably guessed by now we're off to the preset manager and duplicate and rename. And I've called it VelocityOne Flight Twin Turbo Reverse. And that should now be the active profile for the quad. We're now going to configure throttle 1 and 2 to the same axis on the quad. To do that, we need to go to Power Management and then Throttle. Our throttle 1 axis has already been configured in the previous profile. So to configure the second axis, change the filter to all, Power Management and Throttle. There's our throttle 1 axis. We're looking for throttle 2 axis. There it is. Select that and now move the lever on the top quad. And it will register and give us a warning message that it's already assigned to throttle 1. But we know that, we're happy, validate. I must just remember to uncheck the reverse axis. Following exactly the same process, you should go ahead and do the prop and condition lever axis, allocating a second axis to each lever. For the sake of brevity, I've speeded this up and not going to run through it step by step. That's it, we're done here, but if you're using option 1 for the reversers, change to your yoke profile. Then we're going to select Power Management and then Throttle, because we need to configure and set throttle to decrease. There's our throttle 1 setting that we did earlier, and a little way above that should be throttle to decrease. There it is, and I'm going to set that to this same hat switch down. And once again I will get a warning message, but I know about that, I'm happy. We don't need to worry about Throttle Cut as it cuts all throttles. We're done, let's give it a test. Advance the throttle lever on the quad and both throttles should move, which they do. Now let me test the propeller axis, and they're both moving. And finally the 2 condition levers. That's working fine. Now let's bring the throttles back to idle and then test the reverse. And we're expecting both to go into reverse, which they have. Again, you can move the levers to come out of reverse, or in my config, press hat switch 2 up. I mentioned that this profile is also good for non-turbo-twins. They don't have reverse, so that function just won't operate. And the condition lever operates equally as well as the mixture axis, so no need to create another profile. This profile will cover just about every twin. To configure our twin-engine jet profile, we're going to be using the Airbus 320, but this configuration will work just as well in the Cessna CJ4 and Longitude. This time we've got a very different setup. 2 throttles. Now I want them to operate independently, and there's also a reverse. There's flaps, but we've already got our Access 4 configured for that, so we're okay. But like most jets, it has a spoiler or air brake, so we're going to have to configure that. I've set up the top levers on the quad as indicated. So we need to set up the spoiler, throttle 1 and throttle 2. Make sure that your VelocityOne quad is selected, and we're going to be building on the twin turboprop reverse profile. So as before, preset, duplicate, and we're going to rename. This time it's Jet Twin Engine. The new profile, which has carried all settings from the previous one, should now be the active one under the quad. Leaving our filter on assigned, there's a couple of things we've got to get rid of: our condition levers and our props. And we do that by selecting the item and then hitting clear current input. Airliners don't have propeller or condition lever controls, so go ahead and clear those. We're not going to clear our throttles, however, but we do have to change their assignments. Both throttle 1 and throttle 2 are currently set to top lever 1. Throttle 1 will need to move across to the second lever, so throttle 2 will have to be the third lever. So let's go ahead and set that up. And we're going to start by reassigning the throttle 2 axis. So we click on the box, open up the configurator, and then start scanning and move the third lever on the quadrant. Joystick R, axis Y, and validate. Now to reassign throttle axis number 1. And we do the same thing, moving the second lever on the quadrant. Joystick R, axis X. Validate, and throttles are done. We can test this by moving both levers independently to make sure that they're operating the throttles as intended. And now it's time to set up the spoilers. I'm going to use the search by name and type in spoiler. This just makes it quicker and easier to find. And what I'm looking for is spoiler axis. There it is, more or less in the middle, and now to configure that to the first lever on the quadrant, which should record as joystick slider Y. I can validate that now, and we're done. I'm using reverse axis option 1. We've already previously set up decrease throttle 1 and 2, so no changes required on the yoke side. So now we can go and give it a test. Apply and save, and let's jump back into the sim. Just check the throttle axes are working independently. That's 1, and now 2. That seems fine, I'm happy with that. Now that is already configured, let's give the flap axis a go. Flaps fully down, flaps fully up. Let's now test the spoiler or brake axis. Fully deployed, and now stowed. For my reversers I'm using option 1, the button on my hat switch. I haven't tried option 2 in this configuration. If it works, let me know. Let's also just take a moment to check the operations from the external viewpoint, starting with reverse. I'll just apply a little bit of forward thrust initially so we can see it in full operation. Reverse thrust now engaged. Reverse thrust should now slow us down, and we should slowly start moving backwards. Let's now deploy the spoilers. They're graduated so we can determine exactly how much they open and close. And now let's test out the flaps. That all seems to be working well. Let's move on to our final profile, the 4-engine jet. What else could we choose for the 4-engine jet profile other than the venerable 747, the jumbo jet? And it's only going to require a relatively small mod from the 2-engine jet profile. Currently we're only configured for 2 throttle axis, and we need 4. The way I'm going to tackle this is we're going to put engines 1 and 2 on one axis and engines 3 and 4 on another. Going to remain with the top levers as before, spoiler on axis 1, thrust levers 1 and 2 on the second axis and 3 and 4 on the third, and flaps remain on the fourth axis. You could of course configure all 4 top levers individually to each throttle and then assign buttons to the flap and spoiler axis. These profiles are just a general guideline and to get you up and away. Once you've got these established, you want to make any changes, well, it should be relatively easy to do so. Back to our control options menu and make sure we're on the twin engine jet profile, and now we will create another profile as we have done before using duplicate. This time I'm going to call it the JetForEngine profile. Now that's done, our first protocol is to power management and throttle. We need to reassign throttle 2 to the same axis as throttle 1. So we click on the box for the assignment for throttle 2, start to scan and then move the second lever. Comes up with a warning message which we were expecting and we can validate. Now change the filter to all, and under throttle we're looking for throttle 4 axis, and we're going to configure this to the third lever on top of the quadrant. Start scanning, move the lever, it records, joystick R, axis Y and validate. Now on to throttle axis 3, there it is, and we do exactly the same thing. We expect a warning message, but we're okay with that. I'm not quite done because I'm using the option 1 for reverses. So I need to switch over to the VelocityOne flight yoke to configure the decreased throttles. Back to power management and then throttle. We don't have to worry about the hat to up button. That's throttle cut, so it'll cut all of the throttles. But we do need to set the throttle 4 decrease to the hat down switch, as well as the throttle 3 decrease. There it is, we can configure it, and once we're done we can apply and save. And that's our last profile complete. All that remains now is for us to give it a test in Sim. Throttles are working fine, and now to test the reverse levers by pressing the hat to down button, and all 4 engines go into reverse. Press the hat up button and it comes out of reverse. Perfect. Switch to an external view, I've got the flaps coming down and I can test the spoilers. And I'm happy to see that working as expected. And that's our 4-engine jet profile complete. These profiles will get you up and away with most aircraft, and certainly anything using the default Microsoft Flight Simulator configurations. However, some products, and in particular some third-party products, use a non-standard configuration, so certain aspects of the profiles may not work as expected, but coverage of this sort of thing is well beyond the scope of both my time and this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you found it useful and informative. Stay well, see you soon, and bye for now.